From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Monday, June 22nd, 2015. The GOP-dominated House of Representatives reboots fast track for the TPP, simply by stripping away the meager bill aimed at job training for workers impacted by the trade deal. We'll turn to Patrick Woodall to find out what's next. And as the Dominican Republic faces international condemnation for the mass deportation of Black Dominicans and Haitian migrants, will go to Roberto Lovato, who just returned from the island. Plus, Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter reflects on the Charleston massacre and what this moment means for the U.S. as a whole. She's just returned from a Black Lives Matter retreat over the weekend. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan, sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
250,000 people gathered on the streets of London on Saturday, marching from the Bank of England to the Houses of Parliament to protest coming austerity cuts. The newly re-elected Conservative government, under the leadership of David Cameron, has announced mass cuts to public services, saying they were needed in order to cut the national deficit. And in Greece on Sunday, protesters also held an anti-austerity rally in Athens. Greeks have already endured years of cuts in pensions and other services, even as they struggle with massive unemployment. Greeks are bracing themselves for a major deal that is currently being worked out between the anti-austerity Syriza party and the European Union ahead of a June 30th deadline. Well, Rahul, how seriously can people power on the streets impact policy?
Well, Sonali, I think it's extremely contingent on the specifics. In the UK, for example, the Tories have just been handed what they will consider to be an overwhelming mandate in the elections, and I doubt anything short of truly mass protests will dent their resolve in the least. In Greece, where there's a lot of dissension even within the left, sufficiently large protests that show that the left, at least, is relatively united against austerity could very well influence the Syriza government, but small protests will just reinforce a perception that the anti-austerity wing is losing out to the other side.
And we will be following up on the Greece story in the coming days. And The Intercept has published 2 new exposés this morning. One revealed that the UK spy agency GCHQ was engaged in efforts designed to psychologically manipulate behavior. GCHQ is the UK counterpart to the US's National Security Agency. The investigation, co-written by Glenn Greenwald and Andrew Fishman, is based on documents they just published obtained from NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Among the documents is one that, quote, lays out the tactics the agency uses to manipulate public opinion, its scientific and psychological research into how human thinking and behavior can be influenced, and the broad range of targets that are traditionally the province of law enforcement rather than intelligence agencies, end of quote. Also published by The Intercept today is how the NSA and the GCHQ, quote, have worked to subvert antivirus and other security software in order to track users and infiltrate networks, going especially after the Moscow-based Kaspersky lab, whose antivirus products protect hundreds of millions of people. Well, Rahul, this goes well beyond spying on everyone. It seems to fall into the realm of psychological warfare and offensive cyber warfare. Or is that just putting it too strongly?
Well, I think if you think of it as some sort of generalized psychological warfare, that is putting it too strongly. But it's important also not to minimize what it is. So let's remember that the NSA and GCHQ engage in mass efforts, mass surveillance, and mass attempts at transforming the infrastructure of the internet to make surveillance easier. But they also engage in targeted operations against groups that they think are likely to either constitute particular threats, especially cyber threats in the case of this group, or to be part of the community that then creates the organizations that constitute those threats. And I think they're talking about psychological operations mostly within groups like that. Very much like what law enforcement does, but there is the exception that they interpret their remit much more broadly. So, for example, among their working groups, some of the aims are to discredit the Iranian regime and its nuclear program, and even more strikingly, to achieve regime change in Zimbabwe. So these are fairly broad, but they're not. It's not some sort of mass psyops directed at, say, the British or the American public. It's also, I think, important to note that it's a small small group of 120 people. This is a planning document which shows that they're barely beginning to research the basics of social psychology and how to do this. So I doubt this has gotten very far.
And certainly we'll see whether the revelations themselves have an impact on whether those plans move forward. Finally, Pope Francis refuses to rest on his laurels. Just days after speaking out strongly on the issue of climate change and issuing what some called an Eco-Socialist manifesto as part of his encyclical, he took aim at weapons manufacturers. On Sunday, the Pope attended a rally in Turin, Italy, where he said, quote, people, managers, businessmen who call themselves Christian and they manufacture weapons, that leads to a bit of distrust, doesn't it? He went on to call out those who invested their money into weapons manufacturing companies, saying, quote, duplicity is the currency of today. They say one thing and do another. Well, Rahul, he seems to be using his position to influence millions of people, at least Catholics, in a progressive direction. How significant is it for him to go after weapons manufacturers now?
To tell you the truth, Sonali, I think almost everything that popes say about issues like this has absolutely no significance. If you tour Catholic countries and call repeatedly on people to use condoms, that might have some effect, but we've seen this before, and it doesn't take a progressive pope. In the 90s, the pope came out squarely against the Iraq sanctions. It didn't make the slightest bit of difference. Weapons manufacturers are an easy target to sort of bash rhetorically. It's not going to make the slightest bit of difference. If the Vatican were to actually expose, where its investments are and how it's going to shift them away from supporting any of this stuff, that may make a little bit of difference, but people expect this kind of rhetoric from a pope.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Rahul, for some realistic analysis, and we'll talk to you again next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Undeterred by a Senate defeat on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Fast Track Bill, the Republican Party and White House strategized to send the trade bill authorization back to the House to start over. The House voted on a TPA bill without FAA, in other words, a fast-track bill without added assistance for U.S. workers. The vote was 218 to 208. Right-wing Representative Paul Ryan explained the vote in this way, quote, this is a vote for American leadership. This is a vote to declare that America still has it. This is a vote to reestablish America's credibility. The world is watching. There has been widespread opposition among those in the U.S. public who actually know what the TPP is, as well as a good portion of the Democratic Party. But this hasn't meant much to the GOP and President Obama, who seemed determined to push through Trade Promotion Authority at any cost. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi said last week that she doesn't see the worker assistance bill passing, even though House Speaker John Boehner moved to make it possible for there to be a separate vote until July 30th. My guest is Patrick Woodall, Research Director and Senior Policy Advocate for Food and Water Watch, Public Policy Analyst, and he is now joining me from Washington. Welcome to Uprising.
It's great to be here, Sonali. Thank you.
So let me get this straight. First, they tried to attach a pro-labor bill, TAA, to sweeten the fast-track bill for Democrats. Senate Democrats voted it down in order to kill the whole thing, but that backfired because now proponents of the bill are going to just try to get enough votes for fast-track without the measly bone that they were throwing towards U.S. workers?
Other way. That happened in the House. So the House, this is a long-standing kind of balance on trade policy. On one hand, they push pro-corporate trade deals, but they add a worker retraining program to help those who have lost their jobs because of trade. And that's what passed the Senate. When they sent it to the House didn't have the votes to pass both fast track and the worker assistance program together. So Speaker Boehner broke the bill in half, and the fast-track provision narrowly passed, and the worker retraining provision went down to stunning defeat. And that meant that the package was stalled. And that left three kind of unattractive alternatives for Speaker Boehner. One, he could have a revote on the worker assistance stuff, but since he lost by 302 to 126, he did not see the prospects as good. Two, he could try and pass the Senate bill that included fast track and the worker assistance, but the Republicans are largely opposed to ensuring that workers have safeguards even when they lose their jobs because of the trade deals the Republicans push. And option three, which he took last week, was to pass a standalone fast-track bill and then send the whole mess back to the Senate to start again. And this is what happened last week. And now, tomorrow, the Senate will take up a standalone fast-track bill and possibly another measure that will include the worker assistance program. But essentially, the senators are being asked to take it on faith that the House will ever pass the worker retraining bill, and many Senate Democrats that supported fast track in the past have trepidation about supporting a bill that they know in the end Boehner won't be able to deliver on. And the president, although he long said that he wanted to sign both fast track and worker retraining, he now says, well, whatever, I'll just sign the fast track bill and hopefully we'll deal with workers later. So it has a very uncertain future when it heads back to the Senate tomorrow.
Well, it's all very confusing, so I appreciate the clarification. What are the odds that the Senate, because of Democrats wanting, presenting strong opposition, even though they're the minority party, what are the prospects that the Democratic senators would vote for this standalone bill?
Well, 14 senators supported fast track before, and 5 Republican senators opposed it. Ultimately, the passage was pretty narrow. It was 63 votes, and to overcome a filibuster, they need 60 votes, and that vote will happen tomorrow. And so, if three members change their votes, the whole package could go down. Ultimately, the key part is that not only does this vote not have the worker assistance program in it, which means it's a worse bill, but the House included a whole bunch of crazy policy riders to kind of lure more conservative Republicans into supporting fast track in the House. So there is a measure that says that no trade deal can ever address climate change, even though obviously international commerce has a huge impact on the climate, and a measure that says no trade deal can ever address immigration or include kind of cross-border worker movement. Now, those two measures were added as sweeteners to pull more right-wing Republicans to support Boehner's position, and ultimately they needed those votes because it was a very narrow passage. But now when it goes back to the Senate, it has these kind of retrograde riders on it, and they also have weakened a number of provisions in the Senate bill that were added that are very, very valuable, including an amendment by Senator Menendez, which said that you couldn't use fast track to pass a trade deal with countries that didn't do enough to stop human trafficking, which is supported very widely in the Senate, but the House kind of secretly took a hatchet to it in another bill, which ultimately will affect this fast track bill. And they eliminated a provision by Senator Schumer that would address currency manipulation. They watered that measure down as well. So what the senators are going to see tomorrow is a significantly worse fast-track bill than they supported in May. And the question is whether the 14 Democrats that supported fast-track before are going to walk the plank on worker assistance and take a leap of faith that Speaker Boehner will be able to close the deal on worker assistance down the road. And they're also going to have to support a fast-track that is considerably worse than the one they supported just last month.
Wow. So activists who have been lobbying against fast track, progressive activists, several of whom we've been speaking to on this program, now face a bill that's much worse. Was that something that you didn't expect? I mean, are we at a place where even activism seems to have backfired, and are they relying on public ignorance overall?
Well, I think to the contrary, that the public activism and mobilization on this has been essential to gum up the works and to make it harder for the Congress to rubber stamp a secret trade deal and the fast track to accelerate its consideration. Really, the people power has made the huge difference. Ultimately, the fast track has been really gummed up in the House of Representatives, and Speaker Boehner can't control his caucus, and the Democrats are more united than ever that they won't accept a lousy trade deal that will kill jobs, destroy the environment, weaken consumer and public health protections. So I think the activism has been working, has been fundamental to raising awareness amongst constituents, but also amongst the Congress itself. Remember, this is a trade deal that is backed not by a single sector of the business world, but by the entirety of the big business Wall Street pharmaceutical lobby. So the pressure for this from the fat cats in Washington, the Republican leadership in the White House is intense. But despite this really mega lobby pushing this, the people power has managed to really stave off some of the worst things that have been moved in the Congress all year. And even today, there's no clear path forward to victory. The Senate is going to be forced to consider a considerably worse fast-track deal, and there's every reason to suspect that many skeptical senators that reluctantly supported fast-track in May will reluctantly oppose it tomorrow, and that will be sufficient to derail this again, and that really works in our favor.
Now, apparently one reason why there's such a move to push this forward as fast as possible is for the TPP to be a done deal before the next presidential elections in 2016, because there's, of course, a fear that whoever occupies the White House may not be as strong a proponent of the TPP as President Obama. Is that accurate?
Well, generally, these trade deals are a bipartisan love-in the White House. I mean, we're talking about a trade model that has been pushed by George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and George Bush, and President Obama. So we haven't seen a skeptical trade policy president in more than 25 years since this kind of corporate trade agenda took over the U.S. corporate diplomacy. So I think whoever comes in next is going to be receptive to pushing a TPP-type deal. The question is whether the negotiations will break down because this president doesn't get fast-tracked. Remember, nobody that is critical of these trade deals is opposed to international commerce. The question is whether the terms of the trade deals are set only by the businesses that serve to benefit, or whether they benefit workers, the environment, consumer protection. The trade deals that are being pushed now put commerce above all other interests. So if those kind of commercial interests run afoul of food safety or environmental protection or workplace safety, the agenda that's being pushed now would allow these corporate interests to trump on the public interest. And it's past time for us to have a new way forwards, and that's what Democratic leader Pelosi said on the floor when she opposed this current round of corporate trade agenda.
Right. It is an absolutely secretive deal, and even after it does become agreed to, if that ever happens, the actual text is not released for something like 4 years, which is just, makes you wonder what they're trying to hide. Patrick, I want to thank you so much for explaining this confusing mess to us, and we'll certainly follow what happens tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks for...
Patrick Woodall is a research director and senior policy advocate for Food and Water Watch. He's a public policy analyst, researcher, and advocate on economic justice issues in Washington, and he co-authored a book on the World Trade Organization. This is Uprising, and when we come back, we'll take a look at what has been happening in the Dominican Republic with planned mass deportations. After that, Melina, Abdullah of Black Lives Matter joins us to talk about ongoing issues with the Charleston shooting last week, as well as a retreat that happened over the weekend that brought together a number of activists. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. As a June 18th deadline for citizenship registration passed in the Dominican Republic, neighboring Haiti braced itself to receive hundreds of thousands of people in a mass deportation program that has sparked global outrage. In 2013, the Dominican Republic decided to revoke the citizenship of anyone foreign-born after 1929 and then made onerous requirements to prove their citizenship before the deadline. Those people of Haitian origin were particularly targeted as part of a long-standing tension between black and brown-skinned Dominicans. Dominicans of Haitian descent who may have lived in the DR for generations were counted in the same group as Haitian migrants, some of whom were trafficked into the DR as cheap labor. Haiti itself, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, may now be a new home for hundreds of thousands of people, many with no direct cultural or language connection to Haiti. On Sunday, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio gave an address in Washington Heights near the heart of the city's Dominican community and said, quote, "It is clearly an illegal act, it is an immoral act, it is a racist act by the Dominican government." After months of complacency, the international community and media shone a spotlight on the planned deportations. My guest is Roberto Lovato. He is a writer for The Nation and a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley's Center for Latino Policy Research, and he just returned from a trip to the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Welcome to Uprising, Roberto.
Glad to be with you, Sonali.
Now, what has happened since June 18th? That was the official deadline. Have the deportations begun?
Well, I mean, deportations, we have to remember, never stopped. The Dominican government's been deporting Haitians for some years now. They're actually in the midst of building their deportation system, which really only started in 2007, and oddly enough, with the help of the United States government, believe it or not.
So this particular wave of mass deportations, however, have they, I should ask then, has there been a surge in existing deportations as a result of this law that was and court decision in 2013?
Well, there's been intensified activity by the state, by the military, which is very active in immigration matters, and by CESFRONT, which is the Dominican Border Patrol. I've spoken to folks at Solidaridad Fronteriza and Centro Bono and other organizations advocating for Haitian rights, and there's definitely been an uptick in not just deportations, but in rape of women, of going to people's homes and creating havoc, destroying their property, taking it, stealing it. There's been a lot of corruption. There's been just a really, really sad situation. So there's been an increase in that, but there weren't, what didn't materialize were the mass deportations that the right-wing media, which is abundant in Dominican Republic, and some government officials were promising. And that seems to me to be the real story right now. Not so much what happened, but what are they actually doing? And my own sense is that they're basically Obamifying immigration in the Dominican Republic. And because you have to remember, again, who trained CESFRONT? It was the two agencies primarily responsible for the most massive deportation system in our lifetimes. The Border Patrol, the U.S. Border Patrol, and the Department of Homeland Security provided training to CESFRONT, to the Dominican military. And so I'm sure that these are very smart people when it comes to doing these really awful things, and they're going to do it slowly.
Obamifying immigration. So essentially what you're saying is that in order to escape the international condemnation, because there has been a spotlight, they're probably going to try to get it under the media radar, perhaps wait until some of the outrage has subsided?
Yeah, I went to, I'll give you an example. I went to one of these, they're calling them shelters, but, let me put that in quotes. They're really like immigrant prisons, just like, I was in Karnes County, Texas, and they call those family residential centers.
Right.
There's there's similarities in terms of the rhetoric and the way that they're trying to soften the blow of the slow deportation machine. So, when I say Obamifying, I mean, I think that, the U.S. has provided them with equipment, has provided them with extensive training in how to search and rescue, but also how to quote unquote identify suspicious people. And so there's a mass. I mean, there's been a massification of making Haitian suspect in the Dominican Republic, perhaps from the beginning of the state, because
Right.
the state itself has identified itself as being anti-Haitian.
Let's talk about specifically who is being impacted. And I briefly described it as a mix of Dominicans of Haitian ancestry who've been living there for generations, many of whom speak Spanish and not French, Spanish being spoken in the Dominican Republic, French and Creole in Haiti, and some, many of them having never visited Haiti even, as well as migrants who either might have been trafficked into the Dominican Republic from Haiti as cheap labor, or people who simply immigrated to find better circumstances. Does that cover it? What is the group being impacted?
Well, there are different groups being impacted, and I think the media in the Dominican Republic and in the U.S. have gotten it very, very wrong. Immigration in the Dominican Republic, like in the United States, is a very complex field of law. So, just like in the U.S., you have DREAM Act students, you have ag workers, you have, H-1B visa holders who are kind of, some of them tech people, some of them are different. You have different categories of migration. You have different kinds of people being impacted in different ways in Haiti. The one that's the most disturbing, in my view, and in the view of international human rights lawyers that I've spoken with in the UN and other agencies, are the people made stateless, the people who've been denationalized. Effectively, having the Dominican Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land, in 2013 declared that if your family came after 1929, you are effectively not a Dominican citizen, and thereby taking away what's known as jus soli, which means that you're, the right to be a citizen of the place you were born in. So they've taken away the citizenship of hundreds of thousands of people.
And so some have called them stateless people. Is that accurate?
Oh, well, there's a process going on right now. There's a number of people who right now are de facto stateless because the Haitian and Dominican governments have failed to process their papers, give them their documents. I mean, we see this kind of stuff in the U.S.
Right.
So just imagine in offices like the ones I saw down there that don't even have electricity in some cases, that don't have infrastructure, they don't have personnel.
So the Dominican Republic government is able to say, look, if you just have your papers in order, and then you can abide by this law and stay in the country. But what you're saying is that even, first of all, I understand the requirements to get those papers were very onerous, and second, even for those who might have been able to gather them, they aren't being processed. And I also understand that clearly the government can't target, ask everybody in the country for their papers. And so they've been selecting who to ask. And they've been doing that by picking people whose names sound Haitian. And that has been described as ethnic cleansing.
Well, there's been a history of racially profiling and discriminating people of Haitian descent from even before the big massacre in 1937. Like I said earlier, the Haitian state itself, the Dominican state itself was built up in contrasts to blackness, in contrast to Haitianists.
Right.
Some people talk about how Catholicism, militarism, and anti-Haitianism are the defining characteristics of the Dominican state. So this has deep roots. It's showing its new forms. It's like in the United States, racism has changed over years, and it's codified in different ways, and it's including through immigration. So we're watching a kind of a codification of anti-Haitian racism, I think, through different means. And again, it's not just the stateless people, the potentially stateless people. There's people who are just, good old-fashioned undocumented people who are being, hunted down and asked to leave. Again, they're not being loaded up on buses or put in concentration camps, as many people were kind of, I think, hyperbolically putting out there. But there are deportations. There is racial profiling. I mean, does this sound familiar to anybody?
And of course, I think you're right to point out that this is part of an ongoing continuum, not something sort of a new chapter in relations between the two countries. And just to set the stage for those who might not be as familiar with the sort of geographic and historic situation, essentially the Dominican Republic and Haiti are two countries on the same island, the island of Hispaniola. One country, Haiti, being primarily African origin and black, and speaking French, a former French colony, also the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. The other country on that same island, primarily brown-skinned, Spanish-speaking, and a lot wealthier. And so there are long-standing historical tensions that governments have used and fueled. Now, at this point, what do you make of the international response to this? Has the U.S. responded? Has the UN responded? Media coverage was initially scant, but then finally began to pick up greatly. What do you make of the fact that there finally has been some international coverage of this issue?
Well, I think that if we hadn't had that tragedy in Charleston, I think it would have gotten a lot better coverage. Nonetheless, there's been significant coverage, and there's been significant condemnation from even Amnesty International and children's organizations around the world.
Bill de Blasio.
Bill de Blasio, the El Gran Ausente, the one who's shined for his absence in saying anything about this, is Barack Obama.
Right.
Right. There's been statements by the U.S. government kind of sort of condemning what's happening, but you don't see anything along the lines of what happened in the case of the Rohingya in Myanmar. You got to remember that Obama was very forceful and outspoken in that very problematic issue. But when it comes to black people, just right down the street, across the Caribbean street, nada. And I mean, this is why I mentioned, well, I mean, it's probably because they'd be condemning themselves, because my sense is that the Obama administration is doing in Dominican Republic what it's doing in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, which is extending the U.S. border out beyond the normal, quote unquote, frontier that these folks have, that we know, like in Tijuana or Reynosa or Brownsville. They're extending the U.S. border because they're concerned that migrants will come to the United States. That's the pattern you're seeing in the Americas, and I think around the world, where the U.S. is playing a very aggressive role in helping shape immigration policies of nations far less equipped, far poorer than it, in its own self-interest. So again, the some of the equipment being used is made in the U.S. Right. Some of the funding made in the U.S. through different programs. The training and how to racially profile people is being provided by our good friends at the U.S. Border Patrol.
Wow.
So we know their record on racial profiling. Just go to Arizona, here in California, actually anywhere in the U.S. now. You are subjected to certain treatment if you look a certain way, because this is precisely the training that people are getting. It's not just arbitrary. There's a training that takes place. There's a training that takes place among police in the United States. Oh, and by the way, the country, the island of Hispaniola, was called by the indigenous people Haiti. Mm-hmm. So, you have these. I mean, it's a tragic but really fascinating example of the workings of race and statehood that we're watching. And
now, Roberto, during your trip there late last week, what sort of conversations did you have with people who might be facing this deportation? But also, did you get a chance to talk with Dominicans? What is the sense among ordinary Dominicans? Are they in favor of what is happening? Are they ashamed of what their government is doing? Is there any kind of political organizing within the Dominican Republic against this?
Well, the first thing I did was to talk to Dominicans of Haitian descent, who are precisely the people being impacted, who are being denied their right to Dominican identity. I mean, I spoke to a young 26-year-old student who told me this phrase. I think it was like, estoy viviendo una muerte cívica. I'm living a civic death. In other words, I have no rights. I can't go to the university. I can't get a loan. I can't get a job. I can't vote. I can't do anything, even though I was born here. You know, that's kind of like Ann Coulter's dream being lived in the Dominican Republic right now. So I spoke to Haitians who were undocumented. I spoke to Dominicans, and you know, unlike what the media is telling you about Dominicans, Dominicans come in different political and racial kind of shades, so to speak.
Right, they're not uniformly brown, obviously, but
yeah, and the racism of the Dominican state is coloring the entire Dominican kind of diaspora and community, which is sad because there are great protests in New York and other cities led by Dominicans in these cities. And inside of the Dominican Republic, there are many Dominicans who are adamantly opposed to this. Of course, we have to say there is also a significant portion of people who, you know, through the workings of history and culture and quote unquote tradition, have adopted these very racist attitudes. I've spoken to people who were like of different skin tones, some really dark skinned people. And I got, you know, these people who in the United States would be defined as black, sounding like they were white people condemning the Haitians, adopting all these racist attitudes. And so it's a very nuanced and complex, the racial dynamics. And I mean, even thoughtful people like, what's his name at Harvard, Skip Gates, are really kind of, I think, not doing us a favor by some of the statements that they're making, by these blanket statements about Dominicans. We're getting it wrong, not just about the different kinds of Haitians that are being impacted, some of whom are actually Dominicans being impacted that happen to be of Asian descent, but we're also getting it wrong as far as, we don't say all quote unquote Americans are racist. We don't even say that all white people are racist. I mean, unless you're like somebody that believes in white supremacy, and I'm not going to go into that right now, but
yeah. Well, I appreciate your analysis, Roberto, and I get what you're saying. I want to also mention that you wrote a piece in The Nation entitled It's the Day Without Haitians in Dominican Republic, which we will post a link to on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
All right. Thank you.
Roberto Lovato is a writer for The Nation and a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley Center for Latino Policy Research. And we'll be following up on the story as it progresses. This is Uprising. When we come back from this break, Melina Abdullah of Black Lives Matter joins us. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Dylan Roof, the 21-year-old arrested for the massacre of 6 African-American women and 3 African-American men last week at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, is being held on $1 million bond. He was charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of possession of a weapon to commit a violent crime. Roof faced relatives of those killed in court, some of whom said they forgive him. Preliminary investigations revealed that he shot each of the 9 victims multiple times using his handgun after spending an hour with them in Bible study. Some of the survivors managed to live through the ordeal by playing dead. Over the weekend, news broke that a website maintained by Roof called The Last Rhodesian was discovered. On it, he featured dozens of photos of himself with the Confederate flag and other racist symbols and wrote a manifesto about why he was a racist. As the fallout from the massacre unfolded across the national consciousness, many activists from the Black Lives Matter movement around the country gathered in Detroit last week. One of them is my guest, Melina Abdullah. She is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA and an organizer with Black Lives Matter LA. Welcome to Uprising, Melina.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, what was it like to be at this retreat when this horrific, historic incident played out? This incident that really ought to be a game-changing massacre in how we view what race and racism is, happening at a time when you and other activists who are attempting to address these types of matters were together in Detroit.
Well, I just think it was really, really necessary. It was so necessary for us to be together and for us to share that space. We don't often talk about what it's like emotionally and spiritually to be dealing with this constantly. And then the horror of the terror that we experienced a few days ago, to be in a space where we could be supportive of one another, where we could hold each other, where we could really kind of be strength for one another so that we can go back out and organize and be strength for other folks was really, really important. And so, of course, we didn't know that the timing was going to be what it was. But it felt important, just the day-to-day organizing that we do to come together and to kind of hold space with one another. And so for us to be there in such a time of trauma and have each other to hold helped us to kind of process and deal with this in, I think, a way that enables us to move forward and kind of lay a framework and a groundwork for how we move forward as a whole, as a larger society and a larger group.
How do you process a massacre like this? I mean, I'm thinking of the 1963 church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 little black girls, and that incident rocked the nation. Do you see what happened in Charleston as on par with that horrific incident? And if so, how does it figure within activism and organizing?
Well, absolutely. Of course, you know, we weren't around then during the church bombings. But something like this, I think, reminds us that we still live in a country that is fundamentally white supremacist, that there is no safe space for Black people. Black people are not safe walking home. We're not safe, you know, sleeping on our fathers' couches. We're not safe even praying in a church. And I think it's a reminder of how absolutely unsafe this society is for Black people. And it reminds us that we are in a constant state of assault and a constant state of war. What happened was a terrorist act. And I think it's really important that we frame it that way, and that we understand that this was a thought-out assault on Black people specifically in a space that was symbolic of Black strength and resilience. Right. And I think that we need to understand it in those terms.
I mean, some people on social media have said if this was a synagogue and if this was a white supremacist who had killed a number of Jews and who espoused racist anti-Semitic views, we might not hesitate to call it not just a hate crime, but a terrorist act. For example, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who's similar to Dylan Roof, was him and his brother in that case, were individuals who weren't part of an extremist organization but were radicalized online through online propaganda. As Dylan Roof did, immediately President Obama said that was a terrorist act. in this case of the church massacre. James Comey, the FBI director, said this was a hate crime, or it's being investigated rather as a hate crime, and that it does not classify as a terrorist act. And he trotted out some justification for President Obama, even though he's spoken out about racism, refuses to use the T word.
Right. I mean, even if we think about the headlines of major newspapers, they keep calling it hate. I think it's really important that we understand that hate is an emotion. Hate is not the same thing as terror. What happened, that act, was a terrorist act. And you're right, if it were any other group, it would be undoubtedly called terrorism. So I think that it's also indicative, again, of this larger white supremacist frame, right? That Black people are incapable of being the victims of terror, right? That terrorism is not enacted upon or exacted upon the lives of Black people because we're used to Black people being less than human and dehumanized. And that's kind of the place that we've occupied in white supremacist imagination. So we need to, that's what the Black Lives Matter movement is about, is recognizing who we are and our own power and our right to life and our right to live and our right to live without terror. And so I think that we need to use our own rhetoric and use our own frame and think about what this means for us. I think we also need to think about what it means in terms of coming out of this and how do we exert our power? How do we continue to rally behind the understanding that Black Lives Matter, and how do we root out terrorism wherever it is, in the individual forms as well as the systemic forms that are starting to unveil themselves in the aftermath of all this. The way that the mainstream media is covering it, the entire criminal justice system, the protection of Dylan Roof, this kind of desire to understand him rather than understand the victims. I think those things are things that we all need to think about as we move forward.
Melina, a lot of attention has focused in the last couple of days on the symbols of racism in the South and in South Carolina, and that is the Confederate flag in particular, which many people are demanding be taken down. And one state representative, a Republican actually, Doug Brannon, said he will introduce a bill to take it down. Is the fixation on the Confederate flag important, or is it a distraction?
I mean, I think symbols of terror, which is what that is, if we think about what the Confederacy is and what the Confederate flag represents, I think that that's really important. So I do think that it's important that we take that flag down.
It would be like having a discussion about the swastika.
Absolutely. And so I think unquestionably we should take that down without question. That said, that should not be our primary focus because it's bigger than a flag, right? So the flag should come down without question. However, we really need to unpack what kind of society we live in that has allowed this flag to wave for all of these years, right? So if we think about being, you know, we just celebrated Juneteenth, the 150th Juneteenth. And so since then, Juneteenth being the day that my people are from Beaumont, Texas, got word that we were actually free from the system of chattel slavery. So since the supposed end of chattel slavery, that Confederate flag has flown freely in most southern states. And we need to think about what kind of society we live in that continues to fly that symbol. And so that's really the bigger question, not the symbol itself. The symbol needs to come down, but what kind of societal framework we live in that allows it to be flown.
And by the way, Melina, there was vandalism of a Confederate statue in Charleston over the weekend. Someone had spray painted the words in red, Black Lives Matter, and, quote, "This is the problem, #racist." And there were also reports of the Confederate flag being burned. What do you make of that?
Well, one, I don't see that as vandalism. I see that as resistance. I see that as a righteous act, and I didn't do it. So I don't want to make it sound like I did it or know who did it. But I do think that folks have the right to combat oppression. That's an oppressive symbol. And so if people are toppling it. We need to think about that like it was celebrated when people toppled the statue of Saddam Hussein, right? Well, for Black people, when we think about what slavery is, what this legacy of chattel slavery, of racist oppression, of continued kind of just day-to-day fear, and fear about what's going to happen to our children when they leave their homes, fear about what happens when our fathers go to a church to pray, right? If we live in a state of that, how can we not resist it with everything that we have? And if all we have is a can of spray paint, then use that. And so I think that that is a righteous act, and that's an act of resistance.
And more news this week, or this morning rather, that the Council of Conservative Citizens was just reported to have given tens of thousands of dollars in political contributions to Republicans. This is the group that is seen as Dylann Roof's gateway into hate, if you will. He cited them on his website. This is the group that fixates on, quote, black on white crime. And they've given lots of money to GOP candidates. Should we be surprised that the GOP is linked to that type of hate? Ted Cruz, by the way, has said that he's going to return the money. And I'm wondering if you think that's too little, too late.
Well, I'm not surprised. That said, I think that we need to make it a nonpartisan issue. Mm-hmm. There are as many racist Democrats as there are Republicans, and it may come in different forms. But we need to, again, look at the overarching system of white supremacy. We need to come to terms with the fact that Dylann Roof's act was his own act, but it's also a part of a larger system. It's beyond an individual. It's beyond a question of Republicans. It's beyond a question of these small groups. It's really part of our overarching system. It's in our educational system. It's in an educational system that refuses to make ethnic studies a priority. It's in the system of healthcare where even if we take things like infant mortality, the Black infant mortality rate in this country paralleling and being worse in some cases than developing nations. It's in, the system of mass incarceration, and it's in the system of the police murders that plague our communities. And so I think that, yes, it's really important that folks not take money from hate groups, exactly, terror groups. I think it's important that they not take money. But I think it's also important that we think about how this is embedded into every aspect of our society, and how do we then begin to vision a new society, one that doesn't just simply seek to take down flags and say, I'm returning money, but vision a new society where we say, okay, how do we make Black Lives Matter really in a real meaningful way? How do we begin to kind of overturn these systems that keep us oppressed and really keep everyone in chains? Mm-hmm. Because racism binds even those who benefit from it.
Right. On a quick note on police, there was a new Gallup poll that found that confidence in police is the lowest today than it has been since the Rodney King beatings. Finally, Melina, in the retreat that you participated in with members of the Black Lives Matter movement late last week, with this national gathering of activists like yourself, what is the sort of organizing that came out of that? What is the plan, particularly to really have this broad vision, not just have it, we hear about the activism around police violence, but as you just laid out so clearly, this is a much, much bigger struggle, but that also requires a much, much bigger and broader fight then.
Right. So we are really committed to building a mass movement. Next month in Cleveland, there's going to be a gathering of movement for Black Lives. So the gathering in Detroit was only for Black Lives Matter chapter leads. And we're also talking about how do we ensure that this movement moves forward. People are affected on a really deep level by police violence. And what this retreat helped us to understand and embrace is that that's a jumping off point for visioning a larger solution, and for really kind of conceptualizing public safety first in new ways beyond policing, but also kind of doing collective visioning around what kind of society we want to build, and also healing ourselves in the process. And so those were that was the emphasis of the gathering in Detroit, and next month in Cleveland, when we come together with folks who are Black Lives Matter and part of a larger movement for Black lives, we'll continue the conversation and talk about what different spaces each of us occupy.
Melina, Abdullah, thank you so much for joining us and for all the work that you do. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Melina Abdullah is a professor and chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies at Cal State LA. She's an organizer with Black Lives Matter LA. Before we end the show today, I want to pay tribute to a lost colleague and friend. On Sunday, June 14th, Free Speech TV's Jason McCain passed away. He drowned while fishing in the rain-swollen Boulder Creek, and his untimely death came as a shock to all who knew him and worked with him. It was as a result of my chance encounter with Jason in 2013 at the Media Reform Conference in Denver, Colorado, that KPFK entered into talks with Free Speech TV to carry Uprising as a part of their programming. I worked closely with Jason to help raise funds for the production and to promote the show, and I spoke with him by phone just a few days before his death. Jason is survived by his wife, Hava Gordon, and their 6-year-old twins, Lael and Oliver. Thank you, Jason, for everything you did, and we miss you terribly. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our research intern and audio engineer with help from Federico Garcia. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.